The Hounds of Hell. Above the town of Galashiels, on the slopes of Buckham Hill, stand the ruins of an ancient tower. The waters of the Tweed, Ettrick and Gala all meet within a few miles of this spot, at the heart of the border country, and so do the currents of myth, legend and history. Buckham Tower is now decayed and crumbling, and stands near some farm buildings down along a long bumpy track. Crows make their nests in its crannies and rise angrily at any intrusion. Hens peck and chuckle at the foot of the walls, and sheep and cows graze in the field round about. The best preserved part of the tower is the cellar, with its beautifully vaulted stone roof, where cattle shelter from the cold and wind at night. Hanging from this roof are 3 large iron hooks, which look as though they have been there for many long years. If they have, this adds a gruesome echo from the past to the following tale, which is supposed to have taken place at Buckham more than 300 years ago. The killing times were at their height in 1683, and the southern parts of Scotland were full of tales of signs and wonders, miracles and devilry, as the Covenanters were harried across the moors by the likes of Graham of Claverhouse and Doyle of the Binns. One morning in June, Andrew Bruce of Ayrshire, a soldier of the government, rode up to Buckham with a troop of dragoons at his command. He had information that an illegal convectile would take place that day on Ladhope Moor, a bleak, inhospitable stretch of land between Gala and Allan Water, and that the prophet Pedin, the great Covenanting preacher, might himself be there. The Laird of Buckham, a man named Pringle, was known as a king's man, fierce to the point of excess in his hatred of the Covenanters. He, more than anyone, would be well placed to suggest where in the barren expanses of the moor such a meeting might be held, and to lead the dragoons to the likely spot. Pringle was a brute, a man who had so misused his wife and his own son, a boy of 10 or 12, that they had fled from him and gone into hiding. The laird ruled his small domain like a tyrant, abusing his servants, exploiting his tenants, and, at night, drinking himself into furious tempers at the fireside. By day, he would take himself off hunting with a pair of huge and ferocious hounds. But even this brought him little pleasure during these days, and latterly he had used his hounds for a crueller sport, the tracking of refugee Covenanters at large on the moors. So when Bruce of Ayrshire arrived at his door, offering an opportunity for some hard riding and perhaps a scrap with the rebels, at the end of it, Pringle could hardly contain himself. Furthermore, he had a pretty good idea where the conventicle would be held. In half an hour the dragoons were picking their way across the bog and heather, with Pringle at their head. But though he identified the meeting place correctly, Pringle was frustrated by the vigilance of the Covenanter sentries, who had seen the dragoons from a distance and given the warning. It seemed that Pedin, the other ministers and all the people gathered there had had time to escape to the north and scatter across the land. It took Pringle's dogs only a minute, however, to scent out 2 men hiding under a peat bank. The hounds were pulled off and the laird went to inspect their find. The men were George Elliot and his son Willie, known to the laird both as tenants and as firm believers in the Covenant. The old man had fallen and been trampled by a horse during the escape, and now lay on the ground, his chest crushed and his breath coming in painful gasps, while Willie crouched at his side, refusing to abandon him to the mercies of the dragoons. Captain Bruce rode up and questioned the prisoners, or rather questioned Willie, since his father was barely able to keep consciousness. They would be shot, Bruce told him, as rebels against the king, unless they took the oath and denying the Covenant, and gave the names of the principals involved in the illegal meeting. Willie, as was to be expected, refuses to do either. For him, to break the Covenant was to break with God. Neither, he said, could he acknowledge any king but Christ. If these were crimes, then he was prepared to die for them. Pringle urged Bruce to shoot them, or to let him shoot them on the spot, but Bruce hesitated. These were clearly not the leaders, and it would achieve little to execute them out there miles from any town or village. He turned to Pringle. They must be brought to trial if the Privy Council so desires. I must request of you, Buckham, the use of your home to keep the prisoners safe for a night or 2, until I have received instructions as to what to do with them. Pringle reluctantly agreed, and the Elliots were taken back to the tower, old Geordie carried in agony on a horse, and Willie driven along on foot beside him. At Buckham they were thrown into the dungeon, a gloomy pit that had seen little use for the holding of prisoners in recent times. Indeed, it had been more often used as a larder when the laird's hunting tricks brought home a deer, or for the hanging of sides of mutton or beef from the great iron hooks driven into the roof. Captain Bruce and his men, having seen their captives secure, took their leave and rode off. Bruce, it seems, was happy to engage Buckham's services by day, but he had no wish to keep his boorish company at night. Pringle was now left with the 2 prisoners on his hands, but for a while he lost interest in his unwilling guests. He settled himself in front of the fire with his hounds, ate a big meal and got himself inordinately drunk. But in the course of the evening Willie Elliot began to shout that his father was dying and they needed help, that they both needed food and water. The laird's servants had been forbidden to speak or tend to the prisoners, and so eventually it was Pringle himself who had to rouse himself to see to them. What happened next was not witnessed, but the outcome was clear enough. The drunken laird descended to the dungeon, unlocked the door, and, shutting it behind him, went in. There followed what sounded to the servants like a fierce argument between Pringle and Willie, no doubt over Geordie's condition and his need of a drink of water, or a doctor. What he got, in all probability, was a kicking from Pringle that finished him off. This was followed by a scuffling sound and more blows, and by the outraged roars of the Laird of Buckham. "Swine should be treated as swine," he shouted, and the sound of bodies being dragged across the floor could clearly be heard. The servants cowered and retreated back into the light. They were quite certain that murder had been done, once, if not twice. They did not want to know any more. When the laird finally emerged, staggering both from his exertions and from the effects of drink, his face was red and he was covered in blood. He moved back to the hall, driving all before him, but then, at the entrance to the tower, he was met by a single figure, a woman with her head covered in a shawl, who did not give way before him. Something in her manner made him stop. "I hae come for my men, Buckham," said the woman, addressing him by the name of his property in the familiar Scots way. "You ken me, I am Isabel, wife to Geordie Elliot and mither to Willie, and I'm telling you here and lock it up here like beasts, so I've come to ask you for them in God's name." "Lock it up like beasts, they had tell you," said Buckham. "Aye, you micht say that. Come with me, woman, and you shall see your men and how well I'm keeping them. Come down with me, Isabel." He led her to the dungeon door, unlocked it again and thrust her in, following behind with a lantern. There, in the dim light, suspended from the hooks in the roof by their jaws, hung the corpses of the 2 Elliots, just as if they were dead meat waiting to be butchered. The poor woman screamed and covered her eyes, but Buckham pushed her forward, clutching her by the arm and gloating over the sight. She broke away and ran back up the stairs into the courtyard, and there fell sobbing to the ground. The laird, whose cruelty was made doubly perverse by a weakness of character that seems to have made him ashamed of his brutality, even as he practised it, came after her, and stood with the lantern over her, almost as if he would try to help her to her feet. But Isabel stood unaided, and when she was face to face with him, her eyes were steady as she delivered the following curse. "The vengeance of God upon you for what ye had done, Buckham. Like your ain hounds that ye set upon innocent folk at the prayers in the wilderness, your evil deeds shall haunt ye like the hounds of hell, and pursue ye nicht and day, waking and sleeping. Nae refuge shall ye hae from them in this life, and for all eternity." She turned and disappeared into the night. Buckham's face had drained of colour, and the blood of his victims upon it showed dark against his pallor. He returned to the hall and was about to throw himself into a chair when the 2 great hounds rose from beside the fire and stood watching him with what seemed to be a new malevolence. He started, swayed before them, then flung himself from the room and into his bedchamber. But on that and all successive nights, sleep would come only fitfully for the Laird of Buckham. He would wake screaming, fighting off the hounds that Isabel Elliot had set on his track. Sometimes he would rise and ride through the night, as if trying to shake them from his trail, and return on a broken horse, his clothes torn and mud-stained, in the early morning. Sometimes it seemed the hounds had gotten inside the tower itself, and were howling from the dungeon, a place he never again dared to enter after the terrible night he strung up Geordie and Willie Elliot. And, though the curse was his alone, yet there were others in the neighbourhood who heard strange sounds at night, the galloping of hooves, the baying of unearthly hounds, and the rasping breath and terrified cries of a man being hunted to his death. In just a few months the endless pursuit took its toll, and Buckham lay on his deathbed, his body tossing and writhing in its final agonies, as if it were being worried by a pack of hellhounds. News of his death reached the ears of his estranged wife, and she returned to Buckham with her son. The son was delicate and nervous, never having recovered from the bullying of his father, but the mother had hoped that in time he would grow stronger and would lead a better life as Laird of Buckham than his father had ever done. It seemed, however, that the father was unwilling or unable to pass his inheritance to such a lily-white pair of hands. For 3 days before the first anniversary of his death, a couple walking one night a mile or so from the tower distinctly heard the baying of hounds passing by, where no hounds were to be seen, and mingled with that sound the cries of a man in fear of his life. The next night, in the hall, the boy and his mother and some of the servants all heard the same noises, but this time approaching the tower itself, where the unearthly clamour stopped, and all that could be heard was a frantic battering at the gate. An old servant warily approached and demanded to know who was there. Let me in, for God's sake," came the pleading voice of his dead master. "Quicker deed, damned or no, I'll never deny you entrance to your ain house," said the servant, and quaking in his boots he unbarred the gate. Nobody was there. On the third night, the anniversary of the Laird's death, his lady summoned a minister from the town of Galashiels, a Mr. Anderson, who came to pray with the family all through the night, in an effort to keep the ghost at bay. For some hours all seemed to be well, but then the horrible din of crying hounds and a screaming man set up again, and this time it came from within the tower, from the dungeon itself. Mr. Anderson seized his Bible and went alone towards the dungeon door. Flinging it open, he stood on what sounded like the rim of hell, for the terrible noises intensified in volume. The minister held his Bible aloft and called in the spirit to desist in the name of God, and there was a certain silence. Then came the sound of heavy steps, as of feet dragged unwillingly towards the Bible. Those servants brave enough to peer from a distance heard the footsteps halt in front of Mr. Anderson, but they saw nothing, no shape of beast or man. Then the minister committed the ghost to the mercy of God, and in a moment the tower was silent again. But whether the spirit of the Laird of Buckham was really laid to rest that night is unclear. For years afterwards there could always be found those who would swear to have heard the hellish hunt in full cry in the woods along Gala Water. The end. Don't forget to like and subscribe and press the wee bell notification. And a huge big thank you to all my subscribers and patrons. See you next week. Bye bye.